Emergency managers have spent decades preparing for hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. But how many of you have prepared for the possibility that someone is actively working to make those disasters worse? Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Crisis Lab podcast. I'm Kyle. I'll be your host today, and I want to cover another one of our articles on LinkedIn and specifically talk about when disasters become battlefields and when disinformation becomes a gray zone weapon. And so this is something I've been thinking about for some time, and I just wanted to put this out there. But emergency managers have spent decades preparing for hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. But how many of you have prepared for the possibility that someone is actively working to make those disasters worse? And I don't mean by making the impact of the disasters or fires worse, although that does happen, but by sending information designed to make the response fail. The traditional view of disaster misinformation treats it as a communications problem. This is sort of our historical view of things. Confused citizens share bad information, rumors spread faster than facts, and agencies scramble to correct the record. And so heading into 2026, that framing is now what I feel is incomplete. What happened during Hurricane Helene in October 2024, during Valencia floods that same month in Spain, and during the LA wildfires in early 2025, all sort of suggest something far more deliberate. Misinformation during disasters is no longer just a byproduct of chaos. It has become a weapon. And in some cases, adversarial actors are pulling the trigger and impacting your ability to respond. So what I've learned in recent weeks with travel and workshops in different countries is that emergency or crisis management professionals, and we all sort of need to stop treating this as a public affairs challenge and start recognizing it for what it is. This is actually a version of gray zone operations that exploits the most vulnerable moments in civilian governance. And this pattern is becoming hard to ignore. When Hurricane Helene struck the southeastern United States in September 2024, the usual post-disaster rumors appeared within hours. False claims that FEMA would seize survivor property, reports that disaster relief funds had been diverted to support migrants, a widely circulated narrative that the agency would only provide $750 to affected families and nothing else. These weren't organic misunderstandings. According to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, 33 posts on X contained claims already debunked by FEMA, and the White House had generated more than 160 million views by mid-October. The volume was significant. But what made Helene different was the operational impact. FEMA had to pause door-to-door outreach in parts of North Carolina after credible threats against aid workers. FEMA's acting associate administrator for response and recovery acknowledged that misinformation was, quote, reducing the likelihood that survivors will come to FEMA with a trusted way to register for assistance. For the first time in recent memory, misinformation didn't just confuse the public, it physically stopped responders from doing their jobs. And in 2026, that word trust is more important than ever. A month later, catastrophic floods killed more than 230 people near Valencia, Spain. The Spanish fact-checking organization Maldita identified 112 separate disinformation narratives circulating about the disaster, from claims that HARP weather conditions caused the flooding to false reports that hundreds of bodies were hidden in underground parking garages. Spain's 2024 National Security Report later confirmed what investigators already suspected, which was that pro-Kremlin actors had exploited the disaster to erode trust in democratic institutions. The initial distribution of key false narratives was traced through Pravda-linked channels and websites connected to Russian propaganda operations. The objective, according to Maldita's analysis, was not to spread confusion about the floods themselves. It was to say, look, your king and your democracy don't work. Then came the LA wildfires in January 2025, where false claims about government lasers causing the fires circulated alongside misleading narratives about political blame. By July 2025, Texas floods were attributed to cloud seeding companies, resulting in death threats against executives of those firms. Each disaster, the same playbook. Exploit the information vacuum, amplify institutional distrust, turn natural catastrophe into political crisis. Now, government entities have their own issues about keeping the public's trust, and most definitely need to work on better services and delivery to the public. But this is deliberate targeting of the one thing institutions need to serve the public with, and that is trust. Why disasters are ideal gray zone terrain. So the concept of the gray zone, that ambiguous space between peace and open conflict where adversarial actors apply pressure without crossing military thresholds, has typically been discussed in terms of cyber operations, election interference, and critical infrastructure sabotage. But disasters create conditions that gray zone actors can only dream of manufacturing on their own. So consider what a major disaster delivers: populations in genuine stress, authorities stretched beyond capacity, communication infrastructure degraded, trust already fragile, and intense public demand for immediate answers that governments cannot yet provide. The information vacuum that follows a catastrophe is not a gap to be filled, it's a vulnerability to be exploited. This is what separates adversarial disinformation from ordinary rumor. Organic misinformation tends to be local, self-correcting as facts emerge, and driven by genuine, if maybe misguided, concern. Weaponized disinformation during disasters is designed to prevent self-correction, to embed false narratives so deeply that official corrections become evidence of a cover-up rather than clarification. The EU has recognized this dynamic at the strategic level. The European External Action Service's Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Framework explicitly identifies Russia and China as actors who exploit crises to destabilize democratic societies. France tracked nearly 80 Russian disinformation campaigns between August 2023 and March 2025. The Pravda ecosystem alone was found to operate over 190 websites targeting 45 countries with automated pro-Russian content with particular intensity in countries of geopolitical interest to Moscow. But recognition at the strategic level hasn't translated into preparedness at the operational level. Emergency managers are still working with communications plans designed for correcting honest mistakes, not countering deliberate information operations. The tools are wrong because the threat model is wrong. The gap between what happened and what was planned for. So here's the operational reality. Most emergency communication procedures or protocols follow a reactive model: monitor social media, identify false claims, issue corrections. FEMA's hurricane rumor response page during Helene was a good example of this approach. Professionally executed, well-sourced, and completely outpaced by the scale of what it was facing. The problem isn't execution, it's architecture. Fact-checking works when false information is accidental and correctable. It fails when the objective of the disinformation campaign is to make people distrust the fact-checkers themselves. When corrections are framed as government propaganda, the standard playbook doesn't just underperform, it feeds the cycle it's trying to break. This is the same structural mismatch identified in our early analysis of gray zone operations across European civilian infrastructure. Single domain response systems overwhelmed by multi-domain pressure. An emergency management agency trying to fight an information warfare campaign with press releases and rumor response pages is operating in the wrong domain with the wrong tools at the wrong speed. The World Economic Forum named misinformation and disinformation as the #1 global risk in its 2025 Global Risk Report for the second consecutive year. Meta announced the end of its third-party fact-checking programs, and X rolled out the Community Notes feature, which has had some impact. And platforms and algorithms continue to reward engagement over accuracy, creating economic incentives for the production of and distribution of false content during precisely the moments when accuracy and accurate information matters the most. So addressing disinformation as a gray zone threat doesn't mean emergency managers need to become intelligence analysts. It means the profession needs to integrate the information environment awareness into the same planning frameworks that it's already using to address logistics or communications and resource allocation. And here I would offer the idea that 3 shifts matter the most. First, threat modeling needs to change. Pre-disaster planning should assume that disinformation will be actively injected into the information space, not that it will emerge organically. This changes everything from staffing plans to social media monitoring protocols to the speed at which official information must be released. Second, trust must be treated as prepositioned infrastructure, not a resource that can be generated during a crisis. Communities with strong institutional relationships before a disaster are measurably more resistant to false narratives than during one. The work of building that trust happens during what emergency managers call the blue sky days. It's the kind of slow, unglamorous work that rarely makes it into budgets or performance metrics. It's not glamorous, it's not easy, but it's the grind of public and community engagement and building relationships that builds much needed resistance to these types of campaigns. And third, emergency management cannot address this alone. The convergence of natural disasters or just disasters and information warfare sits at the intersection of public safety, national security, and digital governance. No single agency or profession controls all three. The coordination models that emergency management already uses for physical response need equivalents in the information domain, bringing together emergency managers, intelligence professionals, platform and analysts, and community leaders in a unified type of planning process and structure. For example, Sweden's total defense model, which integrates civilian and military crisis response across all levels of government and society, offers one template for this type of cross-sector coordination. But it requires something that emergency management profession has historically resisted, which is acknowledging that civilian crisis management is not just a response and relief function. It is a component of national security, and adversaries treat it accordingly. The uncomfortable question for every leader responsible for crisis management is rather straightforward. If the next major disaster in your jurisdiction is accompanied by a coordinated disinformation campaign, which is designed to turn public fear into institutional paralysis, what is your plan? If the honest answer is that there is not one, or that we haven't designed one yet, or we haven't thought about it yet, then the time to build it is now before the next storm makes landfall. Thanks again for listening. My name's Kyle from Crisis Lab, and complex crises don't really wait for professions to catch up. So Crisis Lab, we help senior professionals build the cross-sector thinking that modern threats demand through applied learning, strategic analysis, and practitioner-led research. The forum at Crisis Lab brings together senior leaders from emergency management and all sorts of disciplines together for the kind of ongoing peer exchange and cross-sector dialogue that these types of challenges require. So if you're interested in that, head over to crisislab.io to find out more information. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.